Well, hello. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and I'd like to welcome you once more to the Invisible College, which is something I set up, I think it's about 12 years ago now, to discuss all manner of esoteric things, ancient history, mysteries, self-development, and things like alchemy, and it's developed to doing things like the electric universe now as well. So it's quite a wide-ranging thing, but I've also been focusing very much on prophecy, and in particular biblical prophecy. I've done other prophecy stuff about the Mayan prophecies, for example, written 2 books on the Mayan prophecies, but I'm very focused on the Bible prophecies at the moment, and in particular the book of Revelation. And I think I've done 14 programs so far, which are currently on YouTube. But I'm going to move them as well to this new platform. But anyway, the lecture I'm going to do today is called The Two Witnesses, and it comes in chapter 11 of the book of Revelation. Now, if you've never read the book of Revelation, you don't know what I'm talking about. It's actually the last book in the Bible. And I'm not a preacher. I'm not standing here telling you you're going to get damned and go to hell, etc. What I'm interested in is exploring the imagery in this extraordinary book and seeing how it relates to our own times, because I believe it does. And you can make up your own mind as to how you should behave in the light of the evidence presented here. Because you've got to understand that it's a very modern thing, modern physics thing, modern age thing, to look at the world as just being material. That if you can't touch it, see it, feel it, measure it, it doesn't exist. All other cultures and civilizations have always had a concept of the supernatural. They've always had a belief that there's a metaphysics beyond physics. In fact, it's the title of one of Aristotle's books. It's Metaphysics. So you have to look at the possibility that there is a metaphysical reality behind or above the physical reality that we see. And that's really what all religion is all about. Now, you can dispute whether the religion does anything, or whether it's any use, but that is the metaphysical reality that people have always believed up until quite recently. And I'd like to go one stage further than that and point out that we are not our physical bodies. This is not what people have always believed. We are our souls, and our souls live in our body. They control it and run it. And after death, they leave it. Now, that's also what people have always believed, the ancient Egyptians, for example. And if you've ever had an out-of-body experience, as I have, you'll know that's true, that this body it's a very useful instrument if you're going to live on this particular planet, breathing air, eating the food of this planet, having experiences, being able to see with the light around us, to hear, touch. It's a very, very useful vehicle for our souls to live in this particular planet. But we are not the body. We are that which lives in the body and uses it. And when you realize that, and you take that on board and start saying, well, actually, maybe there's something in this, then you're on the path to real religion, as I would call it. And you must then obviously want to know what you can do about it. So anyway, I'm digressing here. We're going to be doing this lecture, The Two Witnesses, which come in chapter 11 of the book of Revelation. Now, we'll start off at this point here. Right, so there was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, that's John, the writer, the Apostle John, who's writing the Revelation. I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now, there's a few interesting things to say here. First of all, 1,260 days is the same duration as 42 months of 30 days. And I should put in here that prophetic year in Judaism, and we found this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, among other places, was 360 days. In other words, that's a perfect year. And that's because there are 360 degrees in a circle. And the Jews have been very much influenced by their period in Babylon, where they counted in 60s. So 360 days, well, plus an extra 5 intercalary days, would make up a year. So a prophetic year is 360 days. So 12 months to a year, divide 12 into 360, it gives you 30. So anyway, so they're going to trample the holy city for 42 months. And these two witnesses are going to prophesy for that period of time, 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So what does this all mean? Well, the instruction to John that he should take a rod and measure the temple is a direct reference to the book of Ezekiel. In chapter 40 to 47, verses 40 to 47, Ezekiel describes how he is taken by the hand of God to a hilltop. Here he sees the city of Jerusalem and is met by a man whose appearance was like bronze. Now, just before I go into the next bit, that hilltop is probably the Mount of Olives, where Jesus gave prophecies also about Jerusalem and the temple. And I've actually stood on that hill overlooking Jerusalem, and it gives you a wonderful panoramic view of the old city. So we can imagine that that's where Ezekiel's been taken to. The man tells Ezekiel to follow him as he measures the dimensions of the temple. And the man said to him, Son of man, that's a common term used for a prophet. They often refer to him as Son of Man. Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears, and set your heart upon what I shall show you. For you were brought here in order that I might show it to you. Declare all that you see to the house of Israel. Now, again, I'm going to digress for a moment and point out that the house of Israel is not the same thing as the house of Judah. And that might surprise you if you've not heard this before. You remember that when the Israelites came out of Egypt, there were 12 tribes, plus the Levitical priests. And they were led by Moses, and then they settled in Canaan, in what became known as Israel. Well, there was a division that occurred after Solomon's death, King Solomon, and 10 of those tribes rebelled against the king, and they formed their own kingdom, which retained the name Israel. 2 tribes, plus the Levitical priests, remained with the other king, and they formed their own kingdom of Judah. So the people who were of that kingdom were called Judeans, and we call them Jews today. They're the Jews. The other Israelites disappeared from history. They were carried away by the Assyrians, and there's a certain mystery about where they've got to, which I'll cover in later lectures. So anyway, he's being told that he's got to address this to the house of Israel, and that means all 12 tribes, not just the Jews. So this is for more than just the Jewish people. These events were clearly in the future, for he was writing after the Babylonians had destroyed Solomon's temple. Ezekiel was living in Babylon, or around that area. He was one of the people taken away. So they destroyed the temple of Solomon. So he wasn't measuring that, not even mentally or spiritually. He wasn't measuring that. And John, by contrast, that's John who's writing the Revelation, was writing not that long after the Romans had destroyed the Herod's temple. In other words, there's a similarity of experience and hope. Both of these prophets, what they're measuring is not the temple as it was, it's a temple that's to come. I think that's an interesting point here, because the measurements that are given in Ezekiel, and I'm going to leave it to you to look that up yourself, it's a very long, complex, and we haven't got time to go into that here, but it represents a temple that would be very, very large, complex, might just about fit on top of what we call the Temple Mount today. But that, I don't believe, is where the original temple was built anyway. But maybe this new one will be built there. But that's a whole other subject too. So let's get back to where we were. So here is a plan of the temple as presented by Ezekiel the prophet and drawn by Sir Isaac Newton. Now that might surprise you, that Sir Isaac Newton, who we revere as the father of modern science, he discovered the laws of motion and the theory of gravity and many other things as well. I mean, he put together the calculus, which is the great tool of mathematics, the greatest tool. And he wrote his whole book, Principia Mathematica, going into all of that. And yet, what interested him much more, actually, was the Bible, and in particular, the book of Revelation. I mean, he studied it in great detail, and this is the plan that he drew of Ezekiel's plan for the temple that is not yet built. So in his vision, Ezekiel is given a comprehensive tour of the temple, along with its outer courtyards, gates, walls, and multi-storied cells. The man, who we can assume was an angel of some kind, measures each with the rod or reed. Right, so this angel's got a reed, and it's given in cubits plus a hand. Now a cubit was 18 inches, in other words, half a yard. A yard is 36 inches. For those of you who only know about meters, a yard is 36 inches. But a cubit, half a yard, would be 18 inches. But you add a hand to it, and that's an extra 3 inches. And that makes what's called a royal cubit. And interestingly enough, the Great Pyramid of Giza is measured in Egyptian royal cubits. So we're getting connections here with other kinds of mysteries and mysticisms here. And that's kind of what the temple that has been shown to Ezekiel is going to be measured in. So the man who we can assume is an angel of some kind measures each with a rod or reed. And his reed is 6 royal cubits long. I think that's right. The temple complex can be divided into 3 zones. There is the exoteric or outer court. You can see I've marked that in red here, sorry. I've marked that in red here, the outer court. And in that area, that's the bit that's going to be trampled down by people. They're going to get into that bit. So you can call that the exoteric. Exoteric means the outside, the outer teaching, the less formal, the out there for the masses, really. And this was open to the public. And John is told to ignore that, so he's not going to be involved with that. Inside was the inner court with the altar, and I've marked that here. And you can see the inner court in green, that whole area there, and the altar is in the middle of that square where I've written inner court. In the middle of that is where the altar is. And that's where they would carry out sacrifices, normally speaking, in a temple. So you have to understand that temples in the old days were not like our churches today. They were not places where you went along to receive a sermon and a lecture, and you had to go on a Sunday or Saturday in their case. It was a place where they took animals and they sacrificed them and they drained the blood off and used that as an offering. So it's this outer, well, even this outer inner court must have been quite a nasty place with sort of blood and the smell of gore and animals, frightened animals waiting to be sacrificed. It must have been quite a nasty place to be, and yet this is kind of what they required. Now, why they required it, well, that's a whole other subject too, but we have to understand that that's what that was about. But there's also the temple itself, which I've marked in purple here. I don't know if you can see it that well. And only the high priest was allowed to go there. Sorry, you can't see it. It's marked in purple here. And only the high priest was allowed to go there. So this is the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, as it were, of the temple. So John's been told to measure just the green bit and the purple bit, and to leave out the surrounding area which is enclosed in the red bit. So why is John told to only measure the temple itself in the middle courtyard where the altar is? Well, this suggests that what follows is intended to be for the ears of those who are already in at least the mesoteric level of teaching. In other words, they're people who've had some kind of instruction already. They're not just the general public. It's not intended to be understood by the people from outside the temple, those who've not been at least partially instructed concerning hidden meanings. The outer court, which is to say ordinary discourse, will be trampled underfoot for 42 months, or 3.5 years, the same as 1,260 days. Whatever esoteric teachings are given out during that time will not be understood by the masses. And I think that's important. I mean, if you look at the whole book of Revelation, it is a difficult book to understand. And it's not something you can just stumble upon, read and understand it. You've got to study it. And it takes a lot of work, I can tell you. I've been working at this for years. So we've got to understand that the instructions are coming out now are really esoteric and mesoteric instructions. And that's what this is all about. So the vision moves on from the imagery of the temple. It now introduces us to two men who it tells us are to be witnesses with extraordinary power. This is what it says here. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So again, it's that same period, 1,260 days. 3.5 years, prophetic years. A period of 1,260, I just said that, prophetic years. From what is said above, we are to understand that the two witnesses are to be understood symbolically. They're clothed in sackcloth, which is the garb of penitence. And it goes on. These are the two olive trees and two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. So there's a warning. They have power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying, and they have power over the waters, to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. So this is pretty gruesome stuff. Who are these guys? We're provided with several clues. Firstly, the power of bringing down fire from heaven belonged to the Old Testament prophet Elijah. He called down fire from heaven to consume a burnt offering. Again, I'm not going to read that to you. You can find it in the first book of Kings, chapter 1, verses 22 to 40. You can look that up in the Bible. Elijah also brought down the curse of God on King Ahab of Israel and his wife Jezebel. Now, I said to you just now that there were two kingdoms. There was Israel, which was the northern kingdom of 10 tribes, and there was the southern kingdom of Judah. This guy was king over those 10 tribes, and he was married to a very wicked woman called Jezebel, who was a real enemy of Elijah and tried to kill him on numerous occasions. And he prophesied that she would die in the city of Jezreel, and that's in the Jezreel Valley up near Haifa, and that dogs would eat her flesh. And this actually happened, but after he himself had been taken up into heaven miraculously. Now, you probably heard that Elijah was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Actually, Eric von Daniken, you know, Chariots of the Gods, man, that's where he got his name, Chariots of the Gods, because he believed that Elijah had been carried up in some kind of spaceship, that this chariot that came down and carried him up was a spaceship. I think it's more symbolic. I don't think it's a physical spaceship we're talking about. I think it's more likely talking about the sunrise, because in the ancient times they believed that the sun rose and it came in a chariot pulled by horses, and the horses would pull it across the sky, and then it would set in the west, and then the moon would have its own chariot as well. And actually that's one of the subjects of the Parthenon friezes. If you ever go to the British Museum, you'll see these wonderful marbles, and which were brought to England from Greece in the 18th century, and the Greeks very much want them back, by the way. But they're well preserved, and they're in the British Museum, and you can see them there. And you see the horses drawing the chariots coming up, the sun and the moon. So this is what I think that's about. But I'm digressing again. So he put a curse on Jezebel, and he prophesied that she would die in the city and that dogs would eat her flesh. And that actually happened, but after he had been taken into heaven miraculously. And you'll find the story of how she was eaten by dogs in 2 Kings chapter 9, 30 to 37. Interesting. Now, the second prophet is obviously related to Moses. And he's had power to turn water into blood. The first plague that Moses called down on Pharaoh and the Egyptians was to turn the Nile and all other water sources to blood. And you can read about that in the book of Exodus, chapter 7, verses 17 to 24. Moses calls down 10 plagues in all, the final one being the slaying of the firstborn of the Egyptians. Then, throughout the period that the Israelites wandered in the desert, Moses performed miracle after miracle in God's name. Now, I'm not saying that I think these two prophets are going to be Elijah and Moses coming back into the temple and prophesying and doing these wonderful things. It seems like the two prophets are merged. They both have powers, some of which were recognized as being Elijah's powers, bringing fire down from heaven. Others being of Moses' powers, turning water into blood, for example. And both of these figures have these powers. They have been blessed, in other words, to prophesy in the schools of the prophets. They are of the tradition that goes back to those prophets. And that's what it's really talking about, I believe. So why are the two prophets likened to olive trees and lampstands? Well, put simply, in the ancient world, the principal use for olive oil was not for cooking but for fuel oil, to fuel oil lamps. And it's also a reference to the book of Zechariah. I'm going to read you that now. And he, which is an angel, said to me, that's Zechariah, what do you see? I said, I see, and behold a lampstand all of gold with a bowl on the top of it, and 7 lamps on it, with 7 lips on each of the 7 lamps that are on top of it. And there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on the left. Right, so they're pouring their oil into the lampstand. The angel goes on to explain a connection with Zerubbabel, who was the leader of the first party of Jews to return from Babylon to Jerusalem in 538 BC. Now, we talked about that in an earlier lecture. And they began the first phase of rebuilding the temple. This is after the Babylonians had destroyed the temple. There were, I think, 3 returning periods of the Jews coming back from Babylon. And not all of them did, by the way. But those who did come back, and this was the first party, and they set about repairing and rebuilding the temple. Then more of them came back, carried on the repairs, and then the third party came back and they built a new wall around the city, and the city really got off the ground again. But it wasn't fully rebuilt until centuries later, at the time of King Herod, who, in his earlier days, I mean, he was always a cruel man, but in his earlier days, he actually did a lot of building work, and he wasn't really that bad a king. But he obviously went completely nuts because he started killing members of his own family, killed the babies, trying to stop, the babies in Bethlehem, tried to stop the Messiah, Jesus, from becoming king. And there's all sorts of theories about exactly what drove him completely nuts. But anyway, before that, he built the temple, the one that Jesus visited and overturned the tables of the money changers and so on. So anyway, Zerubbabel was the first leader of the first party of Jews that came back to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. And a second time I answered, that's Zechariah again, and said to him, what are these 2 branches of the olive trees which are beside the 2 golden pipes from which the golden oils poured out? And he said, these are the 2 anointed ones who stand by the Lord of the whole earth. Right, so anointed one means a king. So this is another mysterious thing here, but I think there is a connection between these 2 olive trees and the 2 kingdoms of Judah and Israel. That I told you they're 2 different things. So Israel, the 10-tribe Israel after the separation, after the death of Solomon, and the Jews being the other kingdom under Judah, which persisted longer until they were carried off to Babylon. There is here a connection with Moses. In Leviticus, a lamp was also to be permanently lit to symbolize the presence of the Lord with his people. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the people of Israel to bring you pure oil from the beaten olives for the lamp, that they may be kept burning regularly. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. Right, so that's in the book of Leviticus, chapter 24, 1-3. So we got that there. And there's another thing I want to draw your attention to, and that is that Moses and Elijah, or Elijah, I use both pronunciations, were seen by John himself as one of the 3 disciples who went with Jesus to the mountain to watch the transfiguration. And we can see John here in this picture. He's the guy in the middle, the young guy. The 3 were Peter, James, and John. Well, Peter and James were both dead long before the Revelation was being written. Yeah, John was the only one of the apostles to survive, of all 12 of them, in fact. All the others ended up being put to death in one way or another but he was the only one that sort of lived to a ripe old age, and I think he was 90, over 90 when he died. So he's the last witness to the transfiguration, and this was obviously in his mind, I would think, when he was writing this in the Revelation, because there he saw Jesus flanked by Elijah and Moses, just like the two trees either side of the lamp. And of course the lamp is Jesus himself in this case. So anyway, John here we can see is in the middle of the group, and he's got Peter and James on either side of him, and then there's this transcendental supernatural group of the risen Jesus flanked by these two ancient prophets. So then we need to ask ourselves, well, what do they represent as the two witnesses? And I think we're getting nearer to being able to do that. So what do they represent? Well, on one level, I think they're symbolic of the two covenants, the Old Testament covenant of Moses and the new covenant of the Christian church. So let me explain this a bit further. Moses, we know, in the Bible, he's the one who brought down the Ten Commandments, which is the basis of the old religion of Israel, and hence is continued by the Jews. That's the Jews of John's day, the Jews today. They look to Moses and the 5 books of the Pentateuch, as they're called, the first 5 books of the Bible, as laying down the law by which people should live, or certainly by which the Jews and previously Israel should live. So what about the other one, Elijah? Why does he figure here? Well, John the Baptist, I believe he was the reincarnation of Elijah. In the New Testament, Jesus tells us himself that when they ask him, well, where is Elijah? Because it was prophesied that Elijah would prepare the way of the Lord. And he says, well, he's been and you didn't recognize him. And they say, well, do you mean John the Baptist? So that John the Baptist, the whole way that he presented himself, sort of wild man of the desert, is very much similar to Elijah. And they both wear a belt and they both wear rough clothing and do stuff around the Jordan River. So there is, if it's not a physical reincarnation of the soul of Elijah as John the Baptist, it's certainly a reincarnation of the mission, if you feel more comfortable with that. But anyway, John the Baptist and Elijah are connected very definitely in the New Testament. And John heralds the arrival of the Messiah, which is Jesus. Thus he brought a second testimony and the new laws to love God and love your neighbour as ourselves. That's what Jesus taught. So these are the two witnesses, and they're the witnesses who witnessed Jesus in spirit at the Transfiguration, and now symbolically they are representing the Old and New Testaments. John, in a way, he introduces Christianity to the world in that he introduces Jesus. So that, I think, is the connection here, really, with these two particular prophets. And, of course, the appearance at the Transfiguration implies that Jesus himself was working with them. And the two olive trees also symbolize transmitters of sacred energy. As long as they are functioning and producing oil, the lamps stay alight. The olive oil itself is the gift of the Holy Spirit, which is made manifest as grace, caritas in Greek. I'll just say a couple of words on that. There is, as I said about the supernatural world, there is a divine substance which we call grace, sometimes called sanctifying grace. And this is actually what the whole Grail legend is all about. It's about finding the cup that serves this grace, which is needed for our own transformation from unformed to developed human beings. That we need to grow our wings, as it were, and we need this spiritual food in order to do so. And again, this is another subject I'm going to cover in detail in other lectures, but this is what this is talking about here. As I said, this is very esoteric stuff that we're dealing with. And as John himself was saying, this isn't the outer temple stuff, this is inner temple stuff that we're talking about here. So don't be surprised if it's covering subjects which you find peculiar. We're talking about kind of the inner workings of the Christian and the Jewish religions. As long as they're functioning and producing oil, the lamps stay alight. The olive oil itself is the gift of the Holy Spirit. And I've done other lectures on what the Holy Spirit is, by the way, which is made manifest as grace. And then it goes on. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. I'll just stop there for a minute. Well, the city where their Lord was crucified is Jerusalem, obviously. So Jerusalem is being called symbolically Sodom and Egypt. Rather insulting names, you might think. But let's go into that a bit further. For 3.5 days, some from the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at the dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these 2 prophets have been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. That's Revelation 11:7-10. Well, I mean, the simple explanation of that is that these 2 prophets have been, having all these powers, and they can, if you say anything against them, they can shoot you down with flames and you're destroyed, etc. And people didn't like it. They're having a discipline imposed on them. First of all, the discipline of Moses, the 10 Commandments. Yeah, all the things like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not lie. All these things which are actually what's required to have a civilization, a secure civilization. If you don't have those kind of laws, you're going to end up with barbarism and just the powerful destroying the weak, and the whole lot becomes corrupted. And we all need laws to live by, and the Mosaic covenant was the system of laws that were given to the Israelites. But they weren't alone in having laws. I mean, if you look into the history of the Greeks, the great lawgiver Solon gave laws to the Athenians. The Romans had laws. They were written on 12 big tablets of stone in the Forum, I think it was. Their laws. In Britain, long before the Romans came here, we had a king called Dyfnwal Mulmud, which meant Donald the Bald. Yeah, I feel for him. And he's accredited with having built roads, but he also gave the Britons, the ancient Britons, a system of laws, which even today still exists and is called the Malmutine law. And it had things like if there's a stone lying around and nobody's using it, you're free to take it and use it yourself. Everyone has freedom of travel on the road, the King's Road. You shouldn't stop him. You can't stop him because the king has decreed that everyone has the right to travel along the roads. These were things in the Malmutine laws, which were governing Britain. So everyone had their laws. But these particular laws of Moses were for the Israelites, and hence the Jews as well. In the 3.5 days, some for the peoples and tribes and languages and nations. Oh, right, I've done that. The two prophets are killed and their bodies left in the street. Now, this is symbolic of the crisis today in religion. Without true prophets, the oil is not made manifest and the lamp is in danger of going out. And this is the situation we find ourselves in today, especially in the West. The secularization of society and abandonment of religion is having a disastrous effect. Where are our prophets? Who truly hears the word of God and is able to transmit the Holy Ghost for us? We must search them out. Now, it goes on then, the bottomless pit, or abyss, is a synonym for hell. We've already met this in chapter 9, when an angel was given the keys to it and it was opened. The beast that rises from this abyss is the opposing force to the prophets sent from heaven. The prophets are symbols for the Old and New Testament, and hence the Jewish and Christian religions. The beast denies the teachings of the prophets and leaves them dead in the street. And this is characteristic of the modern day atheistic enlightenment. Now there's a thing. We talk about the enlightenment. He's enlightened. To be enlightened actually means to be receiving this special energy which produces a glow, an aura, what sometimes is called a glory. And you see it in saints' pictures and the pictures of Jesus and so on, where they have a halo, or sometimes a whole aureole around them of light, because they glowed with a certain light. So the enlightenment is anything but enlightened. It's actually teaching people materialism and destroying the truth. But again, that's something else for other lectures. So the beast denies the teachings of the prophets and leaves them dead in the street. This is the characteristic of modern day atheistic enlightenment. We'll discuss the exact nature of the beast itself in later programs. It is clearly the same as the first beast of Revelation 12, which comes out of the sea. And that Revelation 12 is the next chapter. This has all the characteristics of a successor to the series of empires described by the prophet Daniel. And I've actually done 3 lectures on the prophecies of Daniel. So I recommend you have a look at those. They're currently on YouTube, but I might be going to move them as well. I'm planning to put this lecture on Gab, and I think I should probably move all those other lectures to Gab as well. But for now, they're on YouTube. The reference to Sodom does not seem to be in connection with the sin of Sodom. Right? Now, it's because God called out Abraham's brother Lot and his family to leave Sodom before it was destroyed. Similarly, the Israelites were called out from Egypt at the time of Moses. They were given safe crossing over the Red Sea. On the other hand, Pharaoh and his army, who were chasing after them, were drowned. Right, so this is talking about the faithful coming out from the corrupted city, which is compared with Sodom and Egypt. Just as the Jews came out of Egypt, or not just the Jews, the Israelites came out of Egypt with Moses, and as the Lot, the brother of Abraham and his family, were called out from Sodom, actually by an angel, and they left the city before it was destroyed. Although there's a famous passage that Lot's wife looked back and she was turned into salt. Now what that means is that she had longings. She didn't really want to leave. She wanted to go back. She was feeling torn, and she's turned into salt because she's not willing to go forwards in the right spirit to embrace where they're being taken to. So anyway, the people who rejoice and won't let the bodies of the prophets be buried are those who despise religion and want to be free to sin as they wish. Having defiled the sanctuary and ignored the prophets, they have turned Jerusalem into a new Sodom. Accordingly, Jerusalem can expect a similar level of retribution. So there are prophecies that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and we'll be coming to that in further prophecies. I think we've already covered it a bit in some earlier chapters, but there are prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem with a great big earthquake and water coming out from under the temple. But after 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Right, so after another 3.5 days, and I'm not sure if we're talking about actual days here or if we're talking about a year as a day, and therefore it's 3.5 times 360, which gives us 1260 days again. I think it might be just 3 days this time. Great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. Now, you have to remember that Elijah was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Jesus went up in a cloud. So this whole idea about going back into the higher realms, the higher worlds, is what we're talking about here. So in many ways, the story of the two prophets emulates that of Jesus himself. He too worked miracles, was murdered by satanic forces, lay in the tomb for 3 days, resurrected and ascended to heaven in a cloud. However, if we take 1 day as equivalent to 1 prophetic year, then the 3.5 days is really 3.5 years. And this recurs in chapter 13. So we'll come to that and we'll have a look and see what that's all about when we get there. And at that hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. Now this is not the only place where there is prophesied earthquakes in Jerusalem. Huge earthquake, and it's happened before. And again, this has a resonance to the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. An earthquake is reported in Matthew's Gospel at the moment Jesus died on the cross. It split rocks and opened tombs. And you can read about that in Matthew chapter 27, 51 to 52. And a second earthquake happens when the two Marys, I'm not sure if that's Mary, one of them is Mary Magdalene, and the other, I think, is Mary, the sister of Jesus. Or it might have been his mother, but I think it was his sister, but I might be wrong on that. When the two Marys visit Jesus' tomb, it is caused by the descent of an angel. So an angel comes down and there's an earthquake. So then it says here, the second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come. Now, the last lecture I did before this was all about second woe, and the first woe, I believe, was connected with the coronavirus. So you'll have to go back into my earlier lectures to see that. But this is the end of the second woe, but there's a third one that's prophesied to come. And I should add that this not only brings us to the end of the second woe, but also events related to the 6th trumpet call. Coming next will be the 7th trumpet, and this will usher in all manner of strange events, including the scarlet whore of Babylon and the beast whose number is 666. Now I'm sure you've heard of the number of the beast, 666. We'll be going into that in either the next lecture or the one after. It depends how much time we have. I don't want to make these lectures too long. So there we have it. And that's the end of the second woe and the two prophets. So I hope you enjoyed that little romp through, that part of the 11th chapter. Still a lot to go, but we're about halfway through the book now, and we're getting into the really meaty stuff. As I said, with beasts coming out of the sea, and the scarlet whore of Babylon, and the woman with stars round her head, and etc. All of those great images. And what you have got to remember with this book is that it is talking in symbolism. It's like a dream, and things are presented in the symbolic form, and it's then down to us to try to interpret these symbols. And because I believe that we're living at the end of the age, that's why we're able to start understanding these things better than even people like Sir Isaac Newton were able to. So thank you very much for your time and your patience, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. Bye.